This week's guest is a writer that explores how modern life actually feels. The constant scrolling, the small humiliations, the way we're all chasing these little capitalist treats instead of searching for true human connection.
I'm constantly being offered things that could addict me. In fact, a lot of the time it feels like that's really the only thing that like culture has to offer me. Things that are like highly addictive that are going to kind of like take me out of my head for a while. There's like the term limbic capitalism, which people use, and I think there are like various avenues you could go down kind of like politically as to why that's so prevalent today. For me, it's like maybe a bit of a cliche, but that is just what life feels like to me at the moment.
His writing career started when Sally Rooney emailed him to say that he'd written a beautiful short story. That was actually the first story he'd ever written, and that then turned into his collection Reward System. His debut novel, I Want You to Be Happy, is about two people trying to fall in love when the world around them feels like it's engineered to distract them. I saw someone on Goodreads has wrote, is this guy called Chuck because all women want to chuck him out the window? And that kind of made me laugh because he is quite avoidant.
That's pretty funny.
If you live in London, you will have seen the book cover on the tote bags of every literary it girl this summer. We talk about how he thinks of the novel as a gift, how quickly a good line can curdle into a cliche, and also writing unlikable characters. We do talk about the end of the book, so if you don't want a spoiler, just skip forward when you get to that section. We also talk a lot about books that we enjoy, tips from authors and writers that we love. So in the show notes, I've included some further reading, and I hope you enjoy everything that we talk about. Welcome to the podcast. It's Jem Calder. Tell me how your book tour's been. Do you find that writing is tricky when you're also having to do marketing, or is it actually really stimulating because you're out going to different places?
I always kind of say to myself that like anytime I talk about writing in a public forum, that's like the spiritual transaction that takes place is like, now that's going to be 3 days of writing that I won't be able to do. It just for some reason mathematically always works out that way. Like it always takes a couple of days to kind of get back to the grind for me if I've like gone and talked about it somewhere. Don't know why that is. It's just I think it maybe makes me a bit too self-conscious, but having said that, it has been really gratifying to like meet people who have read the book and people want to talk about it, and I've found that like really rewarding.
Tell me what people have been saying when you've been talking to them about the book. Have people had a lot of like personal reflections? Where have they kind of seen themselves in it?
I've had a lot of younger women readers have seen themselves in the character Joey. I've had fewer male writers volunteer that they see themselves in the male character Chuck. I did have my first woman reader say that she sees herself as Chuck in one of an event the other day, which made me laugh. I suppose what I was kind of hoping for was that people would see different parts of themselves reflected in different parts of either character, and like some of that is going to be like flattering, like, you know, there's like some nice things that the characters do, and some of it is going to be a bit sobering. Yeah, it's just been it's been really nice, and it's really nice when people seem to really like different bits as well. Like it's not like unanimously there's kind of one scene or set piece everyone gravitates towards, which makes me feel good. Like I wrote a book of short stories before this, and the reviews for that were good, but they pretty much unanimously all liked like 2 or 3 of the 5 stories, and it was like, okay, so I just shouldn't have done those 2 other ones. But this one, you know, it's nice when what people tell you is their favorite part is like quite different throughout. Like it kind of makes me feel like the whole thing is kind of resonating, and different people, you know, that's a really nice feeling that people respond to different parts more.
Can you imagine a book review where it was like, yeah, chapter 14 probably should have just left that bit out?
I mean, I feel like I could write a book review like that about some books I read recently. Yeah, I think you are right. That is the case for a short story. That it's kind of a gamble, right? Like there's no way all of these short, like when you pick up a short story collection, it's going to be pretty unlikely that all of them are going to work for you equally.
Although to me, Reward System really felt like a novel. It is a short story, and it feels, you know, fragmented in the way that, but also I suppose that feels like a reflection of life as well. I love that you weaved all the characters in together.
Oh, thank you.
I kind of read it in one sitting, so maybe that also changed it for me.
Yeah, I think when I was working on that, it originally was going to be really discrete short stories, but actually the issue I ran into is I was just like, but I wanted to write about the same kinds of people and same milieu And it literally was just a thing of like, I don't know if I can bring myself to call one character Nick and then another character Tom, and they're like doing basically the same thing. I like collections as well, where like things kind of circle in and out. Like I feel like you see that, I've seen that more in the last like 5 years, I would say. It feels like more and more writers are doing that. Tony Tulathimutte did it recently to much acclaim with Rejection. And I've just always liked the kind of novel in stories format. I think it's cool.
It also feels really rewarding, I think, as a reader, when you're recognizing people and moments feel like they're piecing together.
Yeah.
And everyone likes to feel like they're really smart, don't they? It's such a clever way to do that. Be like, you remember Julia? She's back.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with you. And sometimes people will say things like that and I've forgotten, and I'm like, yes. Like I can't quite remember who is who, but yeah, it's great. It's great when people pick these things out. Really cool.
Yeah, that collection, but also your novel, I Want You to Be Happy, I feel like has a lot of similar themes in wanting to explore how isolating life can be when we're all really chasing like the constant little treats of society, whether that's like buying things, social media, pornography, just like being constantly in our phones. Why do you think that's something that you're so interested in writing about?
I think for me that just is such a huge part of my reality now, is kind of like taking responsibility for my time in a way where, but you know, like I'm constantly being offered things that could addict me. In fact, a lot of the time it feels like that's really the only thing that like culture has to offer me, is like things that are like highly addictive, that are going to kind of like take me out of my head for a while. And I think, you know, people have talked, there's like the term limbic capitalism, which people use. And I think there are like various avenues you could go down kind of like politically as to why that's so prevalent today. But ultimately for me, it's like maybe a bit of a cliche, but that is just what life feels like to me at the moment, particularly living in London, where like things are pretty hectic. It feels quite difficult to get some respite from that. So you're kind of being, you know, a lot of like public institutions have kind of been hollowed out, and what's taken their place is like companies and all the things that they offer you generally, even if they're not like actually addictive, like, you know, it's like something on your phone, but we know that the phone is manufactured, you know, like the people who design most of the apps are people who have like got experience in gambling and stuff like that. That's kind of like the model that things are based, and that's the kind of model of consumption. So it's kind of, my idea is that like that is like pretty much the engine of mass culture at the moment. And I don't really find that idea so compelling in itself. I just kind of accept that. I think that's just, you know, you live in a different time and there's kind of a different thing going on. What I do find interesting is like how people live above that, and like what happens when people kind of like poke their heads above this kind of just like engineering of their time and attention. A kind of like, it's kind of a cliche to talk about it. Like that's one thing I have to be really careful with in my writing, is it's like in talking about this kind of stuff, I kind of like to have it as like this huge, like invisible ghost that's in the background that like we kind of all know is that. So I if I do comment on it or like make a joke about it, I'll have to really be quite sure that like I haven't seen something too similar to that in another book or in other writing recently, because that's one challenge of writing about this kind of thing, is like, for me, I find the cliches curdle really quickly. When I wrote Reward System, I had a line I was really pleased with about can't remember exactly, but it was in a short story I wrote where one of the characters is writing something on their phone and then goes back and deletes what they wrote and writes a kind of like more toned down, like less emotional version. And I really loved that when I wrote that. But now I've seen that in like 5 other novels. And I don't think that's me being ripped off. I just think that's like these ideas, you know, kind of like as our experience with these technologies or kind of like experience of reality starts to settle a bit, there's a kind of like new level of cliche. And I'm kind of constantly trying to get uphill of that, because I think that's really rewarding. It's harder, but I hope that like people see that, and people see that I'm not just kind of like parroting myself or like things they could get elsewhere. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, to answer your question, it's just such a part of base reality now that for me, I'm kind of trying to write about like almost do like a relationship novel, but like in spite of like, it just feels like forces are conspiring against people to basically like make their lives very, very difficult.
We're being drawn away from connecting with each other all the time, although it feels like we're more connected. And I think that's what your writing captures so beautifully. I mean, I always feel like I have a slight also sense of doom in how much I relate to it, but also I think that's important because the questions that you're asking or helping us to explore is what we take away from it. It's because it's like the price that we pay for connection. Yeah, I really liked one of your lines that was like, the more we spend on our screens, the less bearable human interactions seem. But also generally, you write cringe so well. When real things happen to you in real life, are you then thinking about them? There's one bit where Chuck like drops his wallet and then tries to like pick it up again off the floor and doesn't get it.
Yeah, with two fingers, I think. Yeah, it's so brutal. I do, yeah, and someone's asked me that recently before, and I kind of hadn't actually thought about it, but the way they phrased the question was like, do you think people are going to be worried to hang out with you because they'll think you're kind of like looking... But what I will say is, I'll admit, I do very often make notes about like things I've seen that are funny or like, you know, these kind of like micro reactions people have, but it's very infrequent that any note I've made like that actually makes it into the final thing. It always looks out of place. And almost always, if there's some like physical comedy or like something stupid someone has done or like mistakenly accidentally said or something, it's pretty much always me, because I kind of can laugh at myself and kind of see the ways in which like I'm deficient and kind of express those, but I'm never really able to like draw directly from other people. And if I am, it kind of has to sit. It'll never be like from the note I've made. It'll be like 2 years later, I'll be like, oh, you know, it'll be like, it'll kind of have to go into the unconscious, like get swirled around and then come back up again. So I am constantly taking notes, to be honest with you, but it's more that I think that's almost just like a practice of like keeping my level of observance high. But ultimately, like, I make a ton of notes, and I get like thousands of words of notes just from like kind of walking around and thinking, but it's so rare that one of those will actually make it into the final thing. But I'm kind of like too superstitious to stop doing that now, to be honest with you.
That is true, isn't it? But I think the process of writing notes surely is helping you remember or giving you the skill or habit of just noticing things more. So it's probably helpful in that way anyway.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think habit becoming skill. I think skill is completely right. I think when I was starting out, I didn't really think too hard about like craft or anything like that. But I think I was really preoccupied with it and working on it a lot. But I just mean, I didn't put much thought into the process of writing. And I was just kind of like, I know what's good, I know what's bad. Now I am quite a bit more reverent and I'm quite a bit more protective, you know, of my time or of the thing. I just won't let myself go off in all directions, and I try and keep the focus reined in a bit. I think if you're writing a novel, you kind of have to, right? Like it's otherwise you can just, I don't know, it just feels like it's an exercise that takes so long, years, if you want to do it well, and it's just kind of like you kind of can't waste the time. That makes it sound really boring and doom and gloom, but it is fun. But
no, but it is interesting to think about craft like that, because by the point you've come out with your first novel and you've really thought about the craft and how long it's taken. Also, I feel like as soon as you finished your first novel, there's this feeling of, okay, well, I'm excited to do the next one. And I also feel like I'm going to be able to do that so much better. I read an interesting Substack by Nasha Dolan recently, who wrote Exciting Times and some other fantastic books, saying that she hates it when she meets someone at a party and they're like, oh, I bought your book. And they'll talk about one of her books or her first book, because although that's a lovely thing, she'll be thinking, I don't want you to judge me by my first book because I'm so much better than that. And I feel like that a lot with craft. You're working on a book for a long time, but you're also so much better by the time that it's out, hopefully, if you're like really focusing on doing well all the time. I feel like that's a bit of a difficult tension with like craft and improving, and especially if you're writing a lot.
I completely agree with you. I think Philip Roth says something similar, where he's like, when he would write a novel, by the end of the novel, he felt like he'd gotten really good and kind of like had articulated what he wanted to say, but it made him really embarrassed of like the other like 90% of the novel. And that was what he spent the editing time like trying to like get up to the level of everything else. Yeah, I do agree. And it's been really funny having a novel out, and like quite a lot of the reviews have been like I'm not trying to like toot my own horn or anything, but like they've been
Two's
like,
away.
but no, but they've been like his acclaimed short story collection, and I'm like, where were you when that short story collection came out? Like, I don't know, it got a couple of nice reviews, but people kind of mythologize that kind of thing as well. And I
Yeah.
think also to Nisha's point, what's really funny about that is what I wasn't quite prepared for is like people will read in a kind of like, I don't quite know how to say this, like a level of intentionality in some of your authorial decisions that you were just never aware that people were going to respond to it. And like, I think the only thing I found difficult about the post-release process, like, because you get all kinds of reviews, people saying different things, but it's totally fine with me if my book doesn't work for someone, like more power to you. The only thing I feel bad about is that you had to like waste the time getting to the end of it to realize that. But the one thing I find I struggle with, and I don't quite know how to like metabolize, is when people think they know your intentions and they're kind of like, well, he did this because of this. And it's like, there's no, I don't know. That's the only thing I found in the kind of like process of like receiving reviews and post-publication that's really irked me. And I'm still working out how to, I guess the reality is you just have to like put it out of your mind. But it's strange to me when people think they know why you did something and it's like you've got it completely wrong. But you can't intervene and like explain to them. That's crazy.
My theory on that would be that people don't think they know your intentions, but I think sometimes people want to seem smart by guessing and saying something quite intelligent. So I think that's a big part of review culture. But also sometimes if someone writes like a review on Goodreads or they come and speak to you, someone has their own theory that they've like mythologized in your work and that feels good to them. And they want to tell you because it kind of seems like an intelligent, close critique.
Right.
I like wrote a lot about water in my first book. And people definitely will say like, oh, well, it's so smart how you created this symbolism with this. And actually like the tidal pool really comes to represent. And they'll say things and I'm like, I definitely didn't intend that.
Yeah,
but that's lovely that you've read into it.
Yeah,
I mean, I suppose I chose water because I knew that it was symbolic and that I knew people would be able to read their own space and feelings into it.
Yeah.
But what kind of things will people say to you that are intentions that you've had that you don't really relate to?
I don't want to be too specific, but I think the humor, for me, it's like maybe not like a thigh slapper of a novel, but like humor is something that's really important to me. And I don't really see the point in writing a book with no jokes in it. And I think for some people, the humor hasn't translated at all. And for that reason, and again, I'm not saying that it's like kind of, something you're going to like roll over laughing, but I think there's at least a kind of like irony and kind of like, as you've said, like the recognition, even if it's like someone dropping their wallet in like an embarrassing way and not being able to pick it up, like even just spending 2 lines describing that to me is funny. I don't know, just some people not quite seeing it that way has been, I just wasn't expecting it.
That is hard because that is the most subjective thing I think of all writing is humor. I found it funny. There were definitely bits that I read aloud. I was reading it while I was on group holiday, so we were kind of having those moments of recognition, reading things out. I think I was drawn most to the scenes that were really making me cringe. That was also probably what I read out. But I think cringe is humor adjacent, right?
I think that's really true. I think, again, perhaps it's that I have like a broader definition of humor than like some people maybe. I almost mean like comedy in terms of the like, almost like the historical genre of comedy, which is just like we're reflecting day-to-day life in a kind of way that is like both critical but also not like indicting the person, and it's not trying to kind of like put anyone down, and if anything, like the ultimate goal is to kind of make you feel a bit more understood and like someone might be thinking the similar thoughts to you. That to me is kind of like the goal of fiction, honestly, not to put too fine a point on it. And when people don't feel the same, I'm always like, oh my gosh, why did you read 250 pages of that? It just it makes me feel so bad. I'm like, oh, I wish you could just watch some TV or something. I'm really sorry.
I am a bit confused sometimes what it is that people want from fiction when you read a review that kind of talks about likability or something like that. It's like, what do you think, where do you think the tension or the story would come from if we just had characters that didn't have anything to deal with, or we didn't have any space for them to grow?
Right.
You mentioned there kind of what you feel like the purpose of fiction is. Why fiction and not autofiction or memoir for you? What is it specifically also about being able to invent people that's so attractive to you?
It's a really good question. I honestly think memoir, I just haven't had experience enough. I don't know. I don't, well, paradoxically, this is me being quite open, but I'm quite a cagey person actually. And like, I've had like close friends be really surprised by something I've told them about. You know, like I do tend to, I'm fairly private. I think people kind of know that about me. So honestly, that probably is the resistance with memoirs. I just don't like to give too much of myself away. I've kind of always been like that. Autofiction, I really like and really admire. I honestly think maybe this isn't the best thing to say, but I feel like it's pretty full as a genre, like as in like there's quite a lot of people working in that space, or perhaps, you know, maybe less so in the last few years, but quite a lot of readings I've done and things like that. There's quite a few people doing autofictional stuff. So I don't know. I also view the novel as like, for me, writing a novel is a bit more like a gift. Like it's a bit more like, I think the things that I want to write are like things that things people could reach for in kind of like their worst moments and kind of like find some solace in some way. Like that for me is kind of like ultimately the kind of reason why writing fiction is worth it to me, is just like, honestly, just like for a bit of levity and a bit of fun. Like that sounds glib, but I actually mean that in a really kind of like very serious way. Like I think that's really worth aspiring to. And the novels I like most are the ones that reward like my intellect and also capacity for just enjoyment. And I think part of meeting the threshold for enjoyment is like how closely you adhere to the standards of the genre. It's like folk music. With folk music, there'll always be like kind of like the same chorus, but then people will, you know, pitch it differently or phrase it differently or add in different verse. Do you know what I mean? There are these kind of like elements of sameness. And I really love like the literary novel or the comic novel, or in this case, like the relationship novel. It's not that there's like a constraint on me to kind of like work within this frame. Is that actually I really love the frame and I want to, almost out of respect for writers I really admire, try my own attempt at that and kind of like keep in place the elements of the genre that are immovable. Two people meet and begin a relationship and there's kind of like friction there. That's kind of just like a classic story. It sounds really cringe to say like it's giving back, but that is kind of like the way I feel about it. And I'm reading at the moment, it's a woman called Elizabeth Jane Howard. She wrote these books called the Cazalet Chronicles. And I think they've kind of been really mismarketed as like kind of books that your grandma would read while she's recovering from having like hip surgery, like just based on the covers. But I know Gia Tolentino has written an essay about them and they're being reissued this year and hopefully we'll get a wider readership. But I'm just reading her books and the writing is just like impeccable. Phenomenal. Yeah, the characters are just incredibly deep. But she has like complete, you can tell she just has like complete reverence for this form of like the family saga. And in a way you can kind of like feel her talent, like kind of like maxing out the capacity of that form. But it is just so admirable the way she's done. Like it's an incredible feat. So I love novels for that reason. Like I love is, you know, the tension between kind of form and content, and that it's like we have these kind of, you know, if we're honest with ourselves, we have these kind of expectations for the novel. And I really like kind of pushing against those, but also working within those constraints to give people something that is a novel, like, you know, is something they'll be familiar with, but also kind of at the same time filling it with the things I find interesting, the humor. Do you know what I mean? Like kind of like curating this experience of like what I think life feels like now, but within this frame.
It's so nice to think about that as a gift, because it really is. I think when you love a genre, or you love anything as much as reading, to be able to contribute it and be part of a canon is really special.
Precisely, yeah.
I also love that you're into those, but my first Cazalet novel was given to me by my mother-in-law, and I do remember having a moment looking at the cover being like, yeah, sure. Oh my god, they're so gripping. And it's also a fantastic feeling when you read a book and you know you've got so many more more to enjoy. But that's really interesting to me that that's an inspiration for you. But I understand that, because there's the humor and devastation of life is just captured in her writing so well. And I mean, I know we're in a shorter time frame with the two characters in your novel, but I see that. That's nice.
There's a writer, Elizabeth Taylor, who's kind of...
I saw you wrote her on your foils 4, and I was thinking like Elizabeth Taylor's memoir. I was confused for a moment, but saw it's someone else.
She was actually like alive at the same time as Elizabeth Taylor, yeah, and kind of commented on the similarity herself. But like, again, it's just these writers who it's like, I think there's not really anyone whose sentences I'd rather read than hers, honestly. She just set her canvas was just like, she kind of restricted herself to like pretty small stories about like the lives of individuals and just kind of like populated them with her personality. Her books are just so fun to read, and yeah, that's really the way I'd like people to feel about my novels, and you know, when I've got a few.
Okay, I'm going to read Elizabeth Taylor and then I'll get back to you.
Please do.
Hello, it's me, Freya, just letting you know that you can now buy my debut novel, A Real Piece of Work. It's a book about sisters, complicated families, and what happens to grief when it becomes a collective experience. You can now buy A Real Piece of Work wherever you buy your books, and if you go in store to Foyles, you'll receive a limited edition cotton bandana while stocks last. If you prefer to listen to your books, then you can get it as an audiobook. Happy reading. So let's talk a little bit about I Want You to Be Happy. We've got these two characters, Joey, who's like a 23-year-old barista. We've got Chuck, who's like a mid-30s copywriter. And I know that you're going to Edinburgh International Book Festival. And so I wanted to ask you, if Chuck was going to the Fringe, what would he be doing?
Drinking, probably. Just hanging out, carousing.
Hanging around Pleasance Courtyard on his own with a pint.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. Yeah, I am kind of fascinated by that character, because to me he's kind of like me. There's like a lot I can relate to in him, but I just feel like it's people who kind of like walked, you know, like I just feel like there was almost a crossroads in my life where I went one way and he went the other way. So I also think he would probably be like watching my event, like being really annoyed that I'm doing it and he's not. The kind of like entitlement of his kind of like sense that he is this kind of like thwarted great artist. One of the undercurrents of the novel, and like part of why he's got himself in this kind of position in his life. So I don't know. Probably he'd swerve the Fringe altogether, to be honest with you. But I'm really. Have you been before? Have you performed at the Edinburgh Festival?
Yeah, so normally I go just to watch comedy. I find comedy really inspiring for writing. I feel like other genres can be really rich for, I think also mostly for courage. You have to be so brave to get up on stage, and I just think that helps me write somehow. So I go a few times usually to do that. I'm going to go and watch some plays this year because I'm trying to write a play at the moment. But I'm also doing a reading in a sauna theatre, which I kind of feel like I half regret agreeing to do. But that'll be fun.
Yeah, sauna theatre being that's the thing. That's a
thing.
Okay.
Sauna theatre literary salon. Like, is there a more like millennial combination of words than that?
Yeah, a friend of mine has been doing DJ sets in a sauna, and I just can't. I can't understand it. Where are you based in London?
Yeah, I'm based in London.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because
I'll have to remortgage to be able to go to Edinburgh Fringe, but it will be totally worth it.
But the sauna movement in London feels like it's just kind of hit, like literally within the space of like 3 years. There's just saunas everywhere now. And readings in saunas is kind of it's popped off.
I know this is hypocritical because I'm a writer, but the readings in the saunas, I really can't. And I'm going to be having to do one, but my like local sauna is one in Peckham.
Yeah.
And they do, in the off gosh thing, they also do a bit of a reading, and you're so close to everyone. And when they're really earnest, I just have to close my eyes and disassociate, because when they're suddenly doing poetry and you're next to all these strangers in a bikini, it's too much.
Crazy. Yeah, much too much. That's so exciting about you writing a play. Sounds great.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes. But it's nice to try different disciplines.
Yeah.
Are you going to go see some comedy while you're there? So you'll be in Edinburgh to do a talk.
I will be, yeah. I'll be there. There's a couple of other... Rebecca Perry's doing an event there, who's a writer I really like, so I'm going to try and catch her. Yeah, there's a few... To be honest with you, I'm doing 2 events over 2 nights there, so I'm kind of... My plan is to just kind of walk around and absorb, because I'm also not really sure of what to expect. I've been to Edinburgh a couple of times, but not during the festival time. So yeah, I'm bracing, to be honest with you.
I'm going to send you my spreadsheet, and you won't be short of things to go and see.
That would be great.
You'll have an amazing time. So let's talk a little bit more about Chuck. You mentioned that you feel like you're only ever... I think that's interesting as well, to explore someone who you feel like is just at a crossroads only one decision away. I saw someone on Goodreads has wrote, is this guy called Chuck because all women want to chuck him out the window? And that kind of made me laugh because he is quite avoidant. But
That's really funny.
I was reading an interview where you were kind of talking about is someone avoidant, or is the kind of the pressure and the suffocating pressure of like the current economic state is always going to make people avoidant. And I was interested to hear you talk a little bit more about that, especially maybe as a man. There was a bit where Chuck's talking about the rising climate of his fiance's expectations. And it kind of made my blood go cold because I was thinking I related a lot to the fiance and the pressures that she was putting to, okay, well, let's move in and now let's get engaged and all these other things. But, you know, all of these things also are what capitalism wants us to do because they want us to buy a Tiffany ring, they want us to move in. But it was interesting to like read that from Chuck's perspective.
I kind of view it as 50-50 with him, to be honest with you. Well, I do think there's a good point. And I think part of just if you're in, you know, if you're going to live in a certain place and like live a certain kind of life, it's just a very expensive endeavor. And that is necessarily going to kind of, there are just sacrifices you have to make in order to do that. And work is one of them. Like you need to have a pretty decent and stable career to like live in these places and eat in these places and go out in these places. And I was kind of interested in people who were like slightly older than myself at the time of writing. Now I've kind of aged into being Chuck myself, but I was kind of interested in people who were kind of like making the decision whether to stay in London or to leave London, because you know, like the pressure kind of catches up with you, and how that kind of gradual strain could probably like set in over a decade and kind of like take something that is pretty good and make you fairly resentful about that. But having said that, that's kind of like me giving the fairness to Chuck. But also like he, as you say, like he kind of has this, and I think there are reasons that are like encoded in the culture that make him the way he is. But I also think one of his problems is like that he doesn't really take responsibility for his actions and kind of sees himself as the victim of a lot of these kind of cultural forces, and so kind of gives himself a pass a lot of the time. So that's the side where I'd be more critical of him. And I certainly don't intend the novel to be like, you know, there's no endorsement or anything like that. But equally, like, I mean, this is the part that like does make me quite unpopular, is like he is a character I feel like a huge amount of empathy for. And I wrote a essay for the Financial Times about the issue of likability in novels. And it's ultimately like, it's completely fine with me if people don't like that character. I actually don't think he's a very likable character, but I do still really like feel a lot of affection for him, and I don't view him as this like defective individual. I think it's just, you know, these are the people that we kind of like build. Yeah, his frustrations are like partly circumstantial, but you know, partly he has himself to blame. Perhaps we could get in, like, I want to talk about the end of the novel, I guess, if I'm going to talk about this. So maybe I'll say like this is a slight spoiler, but I think where the novel leaves him is like intentionally, you know, I have said when people have asked about the ending that like I think one of the characters ends up like exactly where they're supposed to be and one of the characters really doesn't. And I think he ends up in a situation that is ultimately not going to be good for either of the people involved. But I've kind of seen similar things happen in my own life where it's like people get to a certain age and it's just like very difficult to restart, and so there will be a kind of returning to the life you've known. And I'm also not trying to set some like broad rule where it's like that's never a good idea, but like kind of my intention was that like, yeah, particularly for the Sarah character who's like pretty much in the background the entire novel, she's so probably the most hard done by person in the whole thing.
It's not Sarah, the end.
No,
Sarah, why are you meeting up with
incredibly
him?
rough. Yeah,
but he did make some good choices, though. It was good to see him start to feel better and be better, and I enjoyed that there was hope there.
No, for sure. And it's not like, yeah, I actually don't quite mean what I said about it. I suppose I just wanted to show the way in which like all these things coexist, and I think as similarly, you know, with the way things end for Joey, is it's like, yeah, possibly getting your poem published in a magazine, if that's what the email says. Like, there's no reality in which that takes away your like financial concerns, like even for a second. But equally, it's about the fact that your life is kind of like coming through in like different streams, and you're going to reach kind of like periods of growth in some areas of your life, while other areas are going to stagnate, and then that's going to. And I think that, you know, when we talked about the kind of like genre concerns of the novel, that was like one thing I was quite keen on complicating. Is it's like both of them get something and give something, and kind of like give something up, and there's some reward, but it's not quite what you would want for them, or perhaps it is, but it hasn't come in the right way. And I kind of wanted to like revisit reality at the end of the book and kind of like have everything land in a way that felt true to me.
Yeah, truth is incredibly important. And I think a lot of books often want to deviate from that with a happy ending, because it feels like a kind of unwritten contract with the reader that we have to give them a happy ending.
Yeah.
But actually giving something that lands as being very real. And especially after you've had that amazing scene where Chuck's going to like a barbecue at his friend's house, and they're moving away, and there's this pressure coming in of all the friends going away and having this life that you're not sure that you quite identify with. It made total sense to me that he would meet up with Sarah. And I also love an ending that, or just anything in a book that feels like it comes back to the title. So having that kind of like, I want you to be happy. And by the end, it's maybe not clear that either of the characters is happy, but it's also not really maybe clear that either of them know what that would be for themselves. And that's like a lot of life for all of us, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, that's well said. And again, I think it's just about like there are successes in areas of one's life which like don't translate over to other areas, and you kind of just have to like prioritize the areas that you're like really focused on. And yeah, for Chuck at the end, like this relationship that has provided him with a lot of stability, like he kind of sees the value in it, like arguably perhaps not too late to restart the relationship, but like whether it's like do you know what I mean, like whether you can actually move on from that. I don't know, people do it all the time, but
that's a different book.
Yeah, that's the sequel. But that was really important to me, and I agree. To me, like the idea that like these characters have kind of like gained some like incremental self-knowledge is kind of like happy ending enough. And even if like that, because I think there are like a couple of moments with Chuck towards the end of the book where he kind of microdoses like self-awareness.
Yeah.
Like he has these like kind of like fractional realizations, and then kind of doesn't always act on them. But I think even that is kind of like a moment of kind of like him growing as a person. But then you revisit Joey, and it's like, well, it's kind of crazy that your like growth as a person comes at the cost of like you kind of, I don't know, kind of like leading on this young woman and kind of like just kind of fading out of her life entirely. Like, so you know, like I kind of wanted to add complications to the complication.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, to me, that's just like how life's lived. And it's like, there are like ups and downs, and you kind of can't predict what the next one's going to be. That's
my pet hate in novels, when you get towards the end and suddenly a character has a big confession of all this self-awareness and says, I know I've been like this, but I'm going to change.
Yeah.
And so I liked that we had those, like you say, those fraction moments where Chuck is beginning to have that self-awareness, but in a way that felt very real to me. And I think that's one of the most powerful things that fiction gives us, is it's like an exploration in like, what does it mean for someone to be better or to acknowledge to themselves what they need? And I think even if characters are very different to us, that's a very helpful state of mind to be in. And I was wondering if I could ask you a personal question, that if you were going to have a novel written about you, what do you think a happy ending or like a character arc would be for you, like in the next year of your life?
Huge TV rights sales, film rights sales.
You at the end, you're Joey getting an email from Netflix.
Yeah, quite. I honestly don't know. I feel pretty happy as I am, to be honest with you.
That's nice.
Pretty pleased with how the reception to the novel has gone. It's been really nice to see people kind of like engage with it. Like, it's a weird way of saying it, but like kind of in good faith, like kind of not. I think for me, like, you know, that I had a lot of anxiety before writing it about like writing this young woman character, and I was kind of like, if I don't pull that off, are people gonna just probably completely disregard this and view it as a failure? And that hasn't happened, which has been really nice. as we kind of talked about before, it's like that's the kind of funny thing with publishing, is there is this kind of lag where you finish the book and then like a year to 18 months goes by before it's like actually in people's hands. So I have very little anxiety about this book. Like, it's really nice that it's out there. It's really nice that people are understanding it. My anxiety is all like routed into novel 2 now, which is, so maybe the happy ending would be novel 2 being bought in a huge global rights deal and everyone loving it.
Yeah, it is good. Any tips for anxiety are always like reroute into a new different anxiety about a different thing.
Kind of, yeah.
I was very like, by the time I wanted my most recent book to come out, I was like, okay, I need to be well into my next book so that I'm worried about that instead.
Yeah.
Just get bigger, different shaped problems.
100%, which you've done by starting to write a play. That's great. Just
starting to write a play, also doing a podcast. What kind of like distraction is this from all
So
the other
true,
things going
so
on in my
true.
life? No, but I think anything that is good that is like an active doing is always really helpful, because I think it's really easy to be focused on like things or outputs, but actually being like, okay, but it's actually about sitting down and writing, and that's good. Would you ever write a play? Would you ever do anything in a different discipline? Stand-up comedy?
Yeah, stand-up comedy. I mean, as you said, I really like stand-up comedy, and it's something that I really love, but I just don't have it in me to kind of like perform. I will say that I've had like some interest in like an adaptation of this book, and one of the things they ask you is like whether you would want to write it, and I'm quite hesitant to do that, purely because, like, to go all the way back and revisit the craft conversation, like I would say I put in quite a lot of work to kind of like understanding how novels are putting together, and it's not like a finished course that I've taken, like, you know, like it's something that I'm constantly thinking about and wondering about, you know, like what the shape of a novel is, like what people are doing with the novel now, what people used to do with the novel. And I haven't paid attention to things like screenwriting. I think if there was to be an adaptation, I'd, you know, be happy to be involved, but I just think it would be a big diversion. Something about I think I've read a lot more plays than I've read screenplays, though. Do you know Annie Baker? Have you ever read any of hers? I love her plays, like, and her dialogue really makes sense to me, where it's like, and I've actually read an interview with her where she said she hates people reading her scripts.
That's interesting, because I've never seen any of hers. I've only read them.
Oh, I went to see the last one. Oh God, I can't remember the name of it, but I went to see the last one of hers. It was about like women living in a pain management. It was so good. Can't remember, but she and I mean, if anyone out there is listening and is curious, the National Theatre, you can go to the National Theatre in person and watch their archive, and they have. So I watched The Flick, which is a play of hers. I also went to her play John was on at the Dorfman in the National Theatre, and that was playing while The Beast from the East happened, that huge storm. So they did like really discounted tickets. So I went to see it like 4 or 5 times, just because it was like there was no one able to go because like the place had been snowed in. But she's so good. She's like such a monumental talent. There's part of me which is like, I just don't know that I could take that on. How do you feel? Like
Infinite Life, I think.
Infinite Life, that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just went to see 1536 recently and read the script for that and just was kind of bowled over by it. And I'm really interested in dialogue, but also in movement, and also just to try something different and see what it could feed into my craft in different ways.
Yeah.
I'm also really interested in like meta writing and autofiction, and I feel like performance has quite an interesting lens that it can give you beyond a book. So I'm kind of exploring that at the moment. But I've also read a great play recently called The Writer by Ella Hickson, which talks about writing and the limitations of theatre and the fact that theatre is so white and so male. And that was a really enjoyable read. But yeah, the National Theatre, they also have like an online viewing thing, and you can view loads of them, which is cool. So you can just sit at home and be cultured. And sorry, don't mind me, I'm just watching a play on my laptop.
Yeah, they're brilliant.
And I'm really excited to see some like the clown stuff at Edinburgh as well, just different stuff, which will be good.
Really? Damn.
Yeah.
Yeah, people talk about clown, and I don't think I knew until this year that it's like a whole kind of, it's a whole world. Like that, like there are people innovating in the clown space.
But clowning isn't about, I think people have an idea that it's like white makeup and red nose, but clowning is about truth and using your body to be true and to be able to like channel truth in a very different way. So I think for
Right.
writing, it's like fascinating. I'm a huge fan of Alf Lyons, who's a very talented clown and physical performer. But, a lot of her work is about family and gender and femininity. I also really like Josh Glantz. We also went to see Luke Rollison a few years ago, and he was pretending to be a lamp, and that was kind of just more physical clowning. But he like kicked the plug socket and was supposed to catch it in his mouth, and just it hit his teeth, and so there was just blood running all down his front. And I kind of thought that was part of it, and it was taking on quite a surreal horror lens.
Yeah.
And about halfway through, he went, "Yeah, guys, just so you know, like this is not normally like part of it, and I am in like a lot of pain." But he continued the whole thing, and he was amazing.
Oh, that's incredible. I don't have that kind of constitution at all. I would just walk off immediately. That's incredible.
I'm in a lot of pain. I gotta go. It's been lovely to chat. Thank you so much for talking.
Yeah, really. Thank you for having me, Freya. Cheers.